I don't know about you, but personally I've always had a lot of trouble getting into the Wargame series. They just never really clicked with me. Must have something to do with the amount of abstraction in them, or rather, the exact kind of abstraction. I always appreciated the setting and the general scale these games take place at, but I could never actually get a lot of enjoyment out of playing them. So here I was, sitting thinking that, well, maybe until Broken Arrow comes out, we will not have another good Cold War RTS game. And then Regiments came around. At a glance, what you're seeing here might seem extremely similar to Wargame to you. And in terms of the scale and the setting, the two things I actually liked about Wargame, it definitely is. And, of course, both are RTS games. But beyond that, they're actually remarkably different kinds of games aimed at very different people. Maybe to not waste some people's time, Regiments does not have any multiplayer. If you do not care for single-player games, you can already turn off the video. If you do care for single-player games, this game is made for you. As far as I can tell, according to some data, actually silent majority of a lot of RTS players that has been ignored for quite a while, and you might even think doesn't exist. People playing RTS games for single player. It's a strange thought to some, but I certainly am one of those people. And if you're too, well, maybe this video will convince you that Regiments might be worth your time. So if this game doesn't have multiplayer, what does it have? Well, the game has two main modes, both single player only, and that would be Operations and Skirmish. Skirmish I'll only talk about briefly here. It's the smaller of the two modes, arguably anyways. It basically just lets you fight more typical RTS skirmish setups where you get a single battle on a single map. It's customizable to a good extent, and yeah, there's a whole bunch of maps to choose from, a whole bunch of different weather and lighting conditions. This is basically your typical single battle kind of setup. The other mode is Operations, and this is where I think the meat of the game really is. These operations are basically small campaigns. They all span multiple phases, as the game calls them, with persistent elements. You have a single regiment that you take through an entire operation, and as you go on, you'll accumulate points called Operational Authority, which you will use to either replenish losses from your regiment or buy upgrades for it. That is, additional task forces or upgraded existing task forces. You can also spend it on upgrading your deployment cap, so you can actually deploy more of the units at the same time. The rate at which you get points in the battle to deploy your tactical aids, so your off-map artillery and airstrikes. Or also engineering support, which is only useful in certain phases of certain operations where you will be able to build static defenses with this. Each operation is first divided into stages, which are basically the different maps you'll have to fight on, and then each stage contains multiple phases. The max amount of phases is given to you in the UI, and a phase is basically 20 minutes of actual real-time tactical battle on that map. For each stage, there are objectives you have to fulfill. Usually these will revolve around taking and holding positions, but some of the operations have some more interesting objectives going on, and they try to get inspiration by the real-world tasks the represented regiments would have had to perform, and every operation has its own little twists to it. Between each phase, you then get to spend your operational authority on your repairs and upgrades and such, and then if you haven't advanced to the next stage, it puts you right back into where you left off, and you get to continue from there. You also have to choose an event card in between each phase. These are chosen randomly for each operation you do, so every single time you play these cards will be slightly different, and these can come in good and bad varieties. Picking the right card at the right moment can actually be a pretty decisive factor. However, the card effects never feel like they completely overwhelm you, or will be the single deciding factor in any of the phases you play. I'd say they're actually pretty well balanced and a really nice element to have in here. Overall, the objective of each operation is to achieve victory points, and in each stage you'll have opportunities to gain these victory points, and at the end of it all, either because you managed to go through all the stages, or because you managed to, well, not beat a stage, all the points will be tallied up, and you'll be rated from basically defeat to total victory. And as long as you get any kind of victory, you'll unlock the next operation to play. So, let's talk about the actual meat and potatoes of the game, though. The kind of stuff you do about 90% of playing the game, which is commanding your units and, you know, doing real-time strategy game stuff. The game, at a glance, will look very familiar to people who played Wargame. However, there's actually quite a few little things you will have to unlearn from Wargame if you actually want to be good at Regiments. But once you do, I'm pretty sure it'll click with you. One very important key aspect of Regiments is that it is fundamentally abstracted to the platoon level at the lowest. Everything you see below the level of a platoon isn't actually necessarily there, at least not the way that it looks. What that means is, the positions of individual vehicles here actually doesn't mean anything. It is just a platoon. The vehicles do represent the actual amount of vehicles in the platoon, and you can also tell whether infantry is deployed or not, and each individual soldier does represent a soldier in the platoon, but there are no individual firing arcs for the vehicles or anything like that. There are no different formations, because they wouldn't matter anyways. You command entire platoons, not individual vehicles or soldiers. And this actually does come with a whole lot of simplifications and streamlining compared to something like Wargame. You also do not have to deal with stuff like individually dice-rolled vehicle breakdowns or ricochets or specific system damage or anything like that. Everything is much simpler and streamlined to work on a platoon basis. There's also no such thing as vehicle or terrain collision. Well, enemy platoons will prevent your platoons from moving through them, but allied units can move through each other, and if you look closely you can see that all these units here are moving through the buildings. The thing is, as I said, this means that there's actually no hassle with moving units through these and getting stuck on each other, which would be pretty bad, especially when you cannot control individual vehicles in the first place. This game feels extremely snappy as a result. There's rarely ever a moment where my units were doing things that I didn't tell them to do, and I felt like I had to babysit them. I don't have to really worry about an individual tank being in cover or not, or whether its exact firing arc can cover what I wanted to cover. There are some very neat UI tools that show you all the relevant information, and whenever you move a unit somewhere, you can already see on the cursor whether the platoon will be in cover or not, whether an enemy that you're pointing at is in range or not, a lot of things like that. There's relatively little micromanagement of units as a result. The only thing really being mechanized infantry, which will generally not automatically deploy their soldiers. You have to press a button for that. And this does make a big difference, because when mechanized infantry is deployed, The entire platoon will move a lot slower, but the infantry will actually basically take hits for the APCs, and they can use their own weapons. And at about 800 meters, infantry is actually extremely dangerous to enemy tanks, especially in the flank or in the rear. In general, flanking and attacking the enemy's rear are probably some of the biggest things you have to embrace in this game. This game really tries to go all in on the idea of quick maneuver warfare, which is mostly pretty appropriate for the doctrine of the time. There are suppression and panic mechanics that basically just apply debuffs to enemy units whenever they get shelled a whole lot, so finding enemy units, pinning them with artillery, then outflanking them and destroying them really quickly when you get close and into their rear is one of the core loops you'll be doing a whole lot in this game. In general, this game does not let you turtle. If you like turtling, you will probably not like this game a lot. But if you like playing aggressively, this game is for you. And even if you don't think you like playing aggressively, I would recommend you maybe give it a try. It's a shame that there's no demo available currently, but if there were, I would definitely say, go get that demo, go play it. You never know, because most games out there are not designed as much and as cohesively around this kind of playstyle as Regiments is. Another very interesting mechanic in the game that I haven't quite seen like this in other games is the retreat mechanics. Other games feature retreat mechanics, but in Regiments, it is such a fundamental thing to do. You will have to retreat units constantly. It is often the fastest way of restoring an enemy's ammo supply. Because of the way the regiment and task force system works, which is that you have basically your own deck of units, but each platoon only has limited amount of reserves that will be replenished every single time unit has taken losses and then you retreat them, there's a very big feeling of responsibility for your units. They will run out if you just use them carelessly. And the game also incentivizes you to retreat units instead of just letting them die and then calling them in again later, by having veterancy only transfer if at least a part of the unit makes it out alive. And veterancy does matter. Also, it is generally faster to replenish a unit and then call it back in, rather than having it be destroyed and completely reformed. The timer is actually longer if the unit is wiped out. So while the game rewards aggressive play, it has to be smart aggressive play. And of course, all of these ties really nicely into the operations meta layer, because generally, every objective you take gives you operational authority to replenish your losses, which you will have to do, but also to increase the size of your regiment or get better equipment for it or better tactical aids. So the faster you take territory, the faster you get more operational authority, which you can then use to upgrade your forces. But also the more risk you have to take in, well, taking the territory in the first place. Because these two layers feed so well into each other, there's been a whole lot of just one more phase kind of moments for me while playing this game. It is borderline addicting. Even though I had a whole bunch of moments where I was feeling almost ready to smash my mouse against my monitor because of very sudden, very inconvenient counterattacks from the AI. These are basically the main threat you'll have to deal with. There's either static enemy AI units, they're entrenched and they just sit there, they will never move. And then you have the counterattacks. The game will warn you about them, they will give you an estimate of how many platoons to expect, and you can also roughly tell from where they will come, because each map will have, I believe, always 2 locations where the enemy counterattacks will spawn. But man, getting hit by an enemy counterattack in a place that you decided to neglect a little bit to defend because you had to focus your forces on actually pushing in another place, that's a thrill that, I have to say, I do kind of like, but it's nothing for the faint of heart. So again, if you want a calm, very turtly kind of RTS game, maybe this game isn't for you. But if you do want something that is challenging and just has a really tight game loop that keeps you going, I'd say this game is phenomenal. But wait, that's not all. Here's another thing this game is actually really phenomenal at, and probably the reason why I felt like making this video in the first place. A little bit of a theme that you might have noticed is cohesive design. And what if I told you this doesn't just extend to the game mechanics, but really the visual design and even the writing in this game? Yeah, that's right, writing in an RTS game. I know, it's been a while since people seem to give a shit about that, but this game does. And I do think the writing might actually be the strongest part of it. Now, that's not true. The gameplay is really good, but I did not expect to like the writing in this game as much as I do. And I had a real Brigador kind of situation with this. In fact, Brigador was one of the inspirations for the style and the tone and the general narrative design, let's call it, in this game. If you don't know what Brigador is, check it out. You might like it. I certainly do. And if you do, then, well, check out Regiments, because it does a similar thing with its narrative design. There's 3 main places where writing really factors in this game. The first one are all the operational briefings. They're pretty straightforward. I mean, they have generally a good tone, they give a good overview of the situation, but of course they do it in a more military kind of way. Each operation is played from the perspective of one regiment, and they only get a situational briefing that they would expect to be able to get at that point. There is not a whole lot of high-level exposition in this game. All the writing in this game is in-universe. That means that it is basically up to you to decipher what exactly is even happening. And, spoiler alert, you kind of can't. And that is very much intentional. One neat thing is that the operations are all alternating between NATO and Warsaw Pact forces. And I really don't want to talk too much about the story that unfolds here, but there is one. There's a plot of sorts. There are twists. It is overall probably one of the most grounded Cold War gone hot scenarios I've seen. And what makes it really special, though, is that it's not just grounded, but it has vibes. There's a very strong, bleak atmosphere in all of this. On one hand, everything in this game feels extremely mundane, but also there's a very clear sense of tragedy that permeates basically everything, and we'll get back to that in a little bit. You might have also noticed that I haven't used the phrase World War III yet. And there's a good reason for that, and this comes from one of the other 2 places where the game gives you a lot of writing, and this is one that I sadly missed when I first played most of the operations, and that is the operational log. This little thing here. Don't forget to click that. You should absolutely click that and read the stuff it tells you here. It is hidden away a little bit, but there's some real good stuff in there, both for gameplay information and for figuring out what's happening in the actual operation, and also as far as general lore goes. Specifically this entry right here, which is the reason why I'm not referring to any of the things happening here as World War III, because even within the game world, they don't really know whether to refer to it as World War III, so I won't, out of respect for the lore. And then the third big place for lore is going to be the one that you have been seeing mostly in the background here, that is the Regipedia, which, again, very Brigador-like, is an encyclopedia for the units, and they have these short little entries, all written from the perspectives of characters in the game world, even including one of the most tasteful ways of handling this, an academic book written about the war after the fact with a fake ISBN number. You will not find a book with this number. This book does not really exist. It just exists in the fiction of this world. And something you might notice as you skim over these ties into what I said earlier about there being a very strong core vision for this game. You might notice that a whole lot of these entries deal with a theme of loss or attrition. This is definitely one of the core themes of the game, and the fact that it has something like that alone, I think, stands out. But what I also find remarkable is how this theme in particular carries over so well into the gameplay of the game. This is a game where you're pretty much guaranteed to lose a whole lot of units as you play it, and losing units and replenishing them is a core mechanic. And also driving aggressively, grinding down the enemy and getting ground down yourself is an experience you will make playing the game. Reading these entries really brings that to life, and vice versa. And I just really love how well these tie into each other. Now, all said and done, well, probably not all, but I think enough for you to get an idea whether you would like this game or not. It's definitely not going to be for everybody. Again, you have to like single-player RTS games, you have to like something that might be a little bleak as far as the experience goes, and a little bit challenging and putting you under pressure. But if you do, then I cannot recommend this game enough. My biggest complaint about this game is that there is not enough of it, especially the writing. Luckily, there is DLC planned. The game seems to be doing well enough, so I'm feeling pretty confident that we will get this DLC. Highlights would probably include the Brits, which currently are only in the game as task forces for the Belgians. But don't worry, Brits, the Belgians in the game speak Flemish, not French, so I think it's tolerable. And they will also be having their own operations, and there will most likely be more factions and operations coming along with them, along with probably some other relatively minor updates to some of the game mechanics, the balancing. The dev has already, for example, added within, I believe, the first week after release, some additional options for the skirmish mode, and in general, there's most likely more to come. I sure as hell wanted to, because, quite honestly, Regiments is the best RTS game I've played in a long time.